Good afternoon, and welcome to the WorldOregon webinar for Great Decisions series. Today on industrial policy, I'll be introducing our esteemed presenter in just a minute. But before we do, just thank you, all of you who are members and supporters of WorldOregon who help make this possible. If you're not a member, you can join at worldoregon.org. A reminder, this is part of the Great Decisions series that we're doing in partnership with the Foreign Policy Association. And all of the previous talks are up on our YouTube channel. This talk will be posted next week on the YouTube channel. Our speaker has been a speaker for us before, and we posted the Know Before You Go, a link to his great talk about his book on China and the US, and encourage you, if you haven't had a chance to read that book or watch the talk, to do so. We'll post that later in the chat, some links on that. A reminder for all WorldOregon webinars, the audio and video are off for all attendees. And so it's just the presenters and WorldOregon staff that have theirs on. We encourage you to post questions for our speaker in the Q&A portion of Zoom. Again, in the chat portion, we will post links or comments helpful to the audience. So questions in the Q&A, links go in the chat. A reminder about some couple of upcoming events. Again, we still have a couple more of the Great Decisions programs is going in through early March, so make sure you're signed up for those. We have a special event next Thursday night with our ever popular OSU professor, Christopher McKnight Nichols, speaking on pandemic exhaustion, pandemic to endemic, comparing what we're dealing with now with the 1918 influenza. This is a very popular program. We have over 400 people registered for it. Highly encourage you to join in on that. It's a great in partnership with OSU and with the Oregon Historical Society. Free event. We'll post a link in the chat. And then, of course, we also have our Long Reads Club, which is our young professionals coming up on weekends. And now to today's event. Again, this is part of the series of the Foreign Policy Association, and today is diving into discussion of industrial policy and looking about the US and our competition internationally. We're thrilled to have joining with us Sam Kaplan, who's the director of the Center of Excellence for Global Trade and Supply Chain Management. In the Know Before You Go, it has a link to that organization's website. As I mentioned before, Sam is a published author and expert on working with trade international, the challenges of China and US trade. His book, Challenging China, was the subject of a talk he gave previously. And without further ado, I'd like to hand it over to my friend and colleague, Sam Kaplan, for a presentation on industrial policy.
Thanks, Derek. Great to see you again, and thanks for having me. I very much appreciate it. It's always fun to be part of these programs, and I love the work that WorldOregon does. It's important stuff. Let's see if I can get this to work. There we go. Yeah, so then thanks for having me. And it's an honor to be part of the Great Decisions series. You know, that there's no dearth of things that we all need to decide in the coming months and years. Before we dive into industrial policy, supply chains, the international economy, and what we should be doing about it all, I thought it's good to look back where we've been. And don't panic that because I'm going to start in 1870, that I'm going to talk for 3 hours. I'm only going to talk for 2 hours. I'm joking. I'm going to be actually relatively quick. I'm looking forward to getting questions and comments from everybody. But since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, the effects of which really kind of started around 1870, at least economically wise, the world has mostly been on a long economic winning streak. For most of human history, we didn't see such economic growth, and so consequently did not see much improvement in human lives. You know, the year 450 was not that different for your average person than was the year 1230 or the year 1527. The industrial technological revolution drove remarkable increases in economic growth. And as you can see in these charts, world GDP was about $182 billion when Augustus Caesar ruled a pretty remarkably violent Rome, and the Han were solidifying their hold on a not that much less violent China. A millennium later, and world GDP had barely grown at all. The same was true of life expectancy and a host of other human welfare indicators. Then after that, the economy picked up a little bit as world GDP doubled between the year 1000 and the year 1500, but not enough that the Fed would have felt like they had to raise interest rates. And then it tripled between the year 1500 and 1870. And then with the full-on blown industrial revolution, it shot up from $1.92 trillion to today, the world GDP is up over a factor of 100 to over $100 trillion. So consequently, the world as a whole is now healthier, wealthier, and wiser. We have more leisure time, despite people claiming how busy they are. We're able to enjoy life more. The world grew economically, changed immensely, and perhaps really the most important thing is life got better for most people. In the last 70 years have especially been ones of remarkable progress. There's been a remarkable reduction in poverty around the world. More people have access to education than ever before. Literacy is at all-time highs. Child mortality rates are down. Humanity has done really well, including and especially the last 70 years. Why did this happen? That's a little bit like asking what caused the Big Bang. We've been experiencing good times since 1870 economically because of technological progress that took off in the Industrial Revolution, along with improvements in governance and the recognition of the importance of markets. Not necessarily a love of markets, but an understanding of their importance. But why suddenly was there rapid technological progress in Britain where the Industrial Revolution began? What caused the Big Bang? I can't answer either of those questions. They're much debated. But for our purposes, what's important is industrial policy is not possible until there is industry. And industry, which has morphed and evolved since 1870, has created today's world. Strangely, it's a much criticized world, even though we've never had it better and we've seen tremendous progress. Again, progress has started in Britain, but then flowed throughout Europe and the United States, and today is going to many parts of the world. Asia especially joined the party since the 1950s. First Japan rebuilt out of the ashes of World War II, which was admittedly a fire of their own making, but then Hong Kong, Singapore, and Taiwan, and then after that, South Korea and Malaysia. And today, Vietnam and Indonesia are rapidly growing, or at least they were pre-pandemic. South Korea is really one of the great success stories of the last 30 years. It's not given as much attention to as the success economically of China. And also, strangely, South Korean artists have become fixated on inequality, as seen by movies and shows like Parasite and Squid Game, rather than on the incredible progress the country has made. Such a contradiction is illustrative of the challenges our world today faces today. Some of them are self-inflicted. But how did Asia succeed so well the last 70 years, and what role did industrial policy play? There's an interesting book I'll recommend called How Asia Works by a guy named Joe Studwell. As you can see in this slide, and to simplify his argument, he concentrates on three factors that drove East Asia's success. Land reform, so giving the land to the farmers and letting them get the most out of the land, directing investment in entrepreneurs towards manufacturing, and similarly getting the financial sector to focus capital on small-scale agriculture and small-scale manufacturing. So if you define industrial policy to include these three factors, it definitely played a role in Asia's rise. I would add a fourth factor to Studwell's three. A post-World War II, post-Cold War, liberalized international order that opened markets for these countries and provided stability for them to operate in a rules-based order. The United States played the leading role in creating that order, but didn't do so alone, didn't do so unilaterally. And this rules-based order wasn't completely to America's liking or thinking, but it was, unlike all the world orders before it, one that was rooted in rules and relatively open. That order, by the way, has been and is mostly being destroyed even as we speak. We're headed towards a pre-World War I world. That era didn't work out so well for humanity, but before worrying about that, let's talk a little bit more about China. China has in many ways followed the Asian model that Studwell outlines in his book. But before they could do that, China had to take a crucial step. They had to tie their economy to the market. As you can see from this quote on the slide, until 1979, China's economy was completely directed by the state. And I don't just mean they had state-owned companies, which they did and they still do, but crucially, the state back then dictated the price of really all goods and services. And this was disastrous and it skewed the market badly. China would not have been successful, could not have adapted the Studwell East Asia model unless it allowed most of its prices to be set by the market. People forget this today with all the talk of industrial policy and mercantilism, which are two separate things, by the way, and with how far-sighted China supposedly is in its economic and other policies. But none of the economic success in China of the last 40 years, the high economic growth rates, the 700 million people brought out of poverty, none of that would have been possible if China had not made the key reform to let the market set almost all prices. But China did make that reform and more or less followed the Asia model and consequently saw enormous success the last 40 years. China is now the second largest economy in the world, the largest if you're using purchasing power parity data. As the industrial policy piece that Jonathan Chanis, that we were asked to read for this Great Decision series, said, this gives China a lot of geopolitical leverage. Companies and people want to sell to and invest in such a large market. But in per capita terms, as I think I mentioned in my China talk last time, China is far behind the United States, European countries, Japan, and a lot of other countries. And its GDP per capita is also much lower than Asian tigers such as Korea and Taiwan at similar time periods of development. China's GDP per capita increased from a low level 4 decades ago, but it's still far behind where one might think it would be after years and years of high economic growth. And you've probably seen people stating that China is going to surpass America's economy, not just in purchasing power parity terms, but overall. They're predicting that China's GDP will be larger than America's in 5, 10, 15, or some other time horizon. This is possible. But it's also possible, as I'm going to explain shortly, that China's economy never becomes larger than America's. And it certainly does not look like in terms of GDP per capita or income levels that it's going to be larger than America. But China is a large, successful country economically. And some people, they want to constrain China's economic ability. Chanis, in his article, castigates so-called, quote, neoliberal logic for stating that economic development is good, no matter where it takes place. Well, first, there's about 1 million different definitions of neoliberal nowadays. So using it in his article is kind of like my saying something is beautiful or ugly. At this point, it's all in the eye of the beholder. But more important, China's economic success is not why people are worried about China. It's a combination of China becoming a more authoritarian government combined with an ambition to change the world order that worries the United States and so many other countries around the world. To solve this challenge is ultimately for China to liberalize. To illustrate this point, let's imagine that South Korea's 1.3 billion people, let's imagine that South Korea actually has 1.3 billion people instead of its actual 52 million. But they still maintain their democracy, current civil society, successful economy, and the boy band BTS still rules young hearts everywhere. Korea undoubtedly would want to have more influence on the world and trying to exert its influence beyond BTS and beyond the phenomenons of Squid Game and Parasite. It's natural for a large, powerful country to do so. South Korea may want to try and reform or make changes to the World Trade Organization, or they may want to make changes to influence digital surveillance standards around the world. The United States and other countries might agree or disagree with these ideas of South Korea, this imaginary larger South Korea, but it's unlikely US Secretary of State Antony Blinken would circle the world to build an alliance against South Korea. And that's because South Korea, a liberalized democracy, wouldn't be a threat to the world. It may want to make changes to the international order, but not ones inimical to a liberal world order. It's unlikely a liberalized democracy would be trying to make the world safe for authoritarianism. It's not China's economy that is dangerous. It is their authoritarian, increasingly fascist government with ambitions to change the world that is dangerous. But as we reckon with this China, with this economically powerful China, we need to remember that it is entering a new economic era. Again, as I talked about last time, they're now facing economic headwinds. They have aging demographics. Under current trends, China's population in the next 20 years will be older than America's. It's one of the reasons why its economy has slowed and isn't going to grow at the rate it had previously. Because again, remember that increases in GDP come from two things: an increase in productivity and an increase in the working age population. Well, China's working age population has been decreasing for the last 70 years, or 7 years rather. And trends for birth rates have gotten worse the last few years, not better. So their demographic situation is actually worsening. In fact, since I last talked to the WorldOregon, the fertility rate in China has now fallen to 1.3, which is lower than Japan's. And Japan has long been held as the Olympic champion of low fertility rates in the world. So China is going to get smaller and older faster than we thought. Population is a drag on GDP, but what about productivity? As you can see in this chart, although China has larger productivity increases in the past than developed countries, each year these increases have been decreasing. And there's other challenges to China's economy, including, as we've seen in the news in the last few months, they're trying to reduce an over-reliance on real estate in their economy. Some have been calling Evergrande, one of the troubled real estate companies in China, its Lehman Brothers moment, thinking that what happened in the United States and the rest of the world during the financial crisis of 2008 is what's going to happen to China. But given the state-controlled nature of the financial sector in China, that's pretty unlikely. More possible is that Evergrande and other problematic real estate companies in China are a harbinger to something more akin to what happened in Japan in 1989 that led to long-term economic malaise. As you can see in this chart, China's economy is stunningly over-reliant on real estate, so painful adjustments are in the cards. Around 70% of the wealth of urban Chinese households is in real estate, and even the rest of their financial assets are tied up indirectly with real estate. So if real estate values fall, as they have been, and if the value of real estate related companies fall, as they have been, including more news today about that, China's middle class is going to feel it, and they're not going to be happy. And so the question is, even as China's government knows it needs to have China's economy less reliant on real estate, can it handle the pain of the adjustment? And in general, China has debt problems. Its debt to GDP ratio is over 300% now, and they're increasing their debt more this year so far. For years, China's economy grew at high rates, in part due to large government investments, but increasingly that investment is less productive. For each won of investment that China makes, there's been a smaller increase in GDP growth. So regardless of whether the current real estate concerns and debt issues lead to economic malaise like in Japan in the 1990s, China's not going to have high GDP growth like they had the last 4 decades. Because of catch up from the pandemic, maybe in the short term they will, but mid to long term, their growth rates are going to be much more similar to ours and to Europe's than to their previous history. China's economy may never get larger than America's, industrial policy or not. But this doesn't mean that China's economy will no longer be important. And China is actively using industrial policy to gain a greater share of current and future strategic industries, or what they regard as strategic anyway. Here you can see on the left the priority industries of the Made in China 2025 policy, which is essentially an industrial policy they've had in place for a number of years. And here on the right is China's 14th five-year plan. Innovation is one of the main components of that plan. And over the next 5 years, China aims to increase research and development investment by 7% each year with a focus on basic research. It's part of their effort to develop advanced technologies listed in the plan, and you can see them listed here. China knows it needs to transform its economy. Whether it's going to be successful in doing so is another matter. China also might, and I'm going to put a lot of emphasis on the word might here, it might be starting to de-emphasize GDP growth in its policies. GDP growth, for example, was not emphasized as much in recent planning documents, nor at the recently completed 6th plenary session, which is a gathering of China's top leaders that took place late last year. And Xi Jinping himself, he's increasingly talking about the concept of common prosperity, the idea of spreading wealth more broadly around China. A lot of people don't realize that China is one of the most unequal countries in the world. But interestingly, Xi, in talking about common prosperity, has said explicitly this won't mean building up more robust social safety nets or welfare systems. In fact, in a major speech late last year, he said China needs to, quote, avoid the trap of welfarism and helping the lazy. So how China will spread the wealth is an open question. In that sixth plenum I talked about, it also featured a so-called historical resolution. The full name was the Resolution of the CPC, Central Committee on the Major Achievements and Historical Experience of the Party over the past century. It's a very catchy title. But experts have been reading that like they're CCP Talmudic scholars or fans obsessed with Kanye West lyrics. And there's general agreement among these experts that it's part of an ongoing attempt to elevate Xi to a more prominent status as he works to get an unprecedented third term at this year's 20th National Congress meetings, which will take place late in the year. Now, Mao's status in this historical resolution is kept more or less in place. Deng Xiaoping is diminished, but most of the historical resolution talks about Xi, and it calls him the helmsman, and it gives him credit for the glorious new era that China is in. So it appears China's increasing aggressiveness and oppressiveness under Xi is not going away anytime soon, and that's going to affect what happens to its economy, including industrial policy. So will China be successful in transforming their economy, and will industrial policy be the reason? And how will Xi's oppression play into this? Let's look at the crackdown of China on consumer tech, which started last year, most famously with the silencing of Jack Ma, who's kind of a Jeff Bezos of China, and his company Alibaba. Some argue the reason for the crackdown on Alibaba and other consumer internet companies is because China wants to refocus on strategic industries, such as those I showed in the Made in China 2025 policy and the 14th five-year plan. In other words, they want to help high-tech industrial businesses rather than consumer tech companies. Some researchers at a place called marcopolo.org examined the 500 largest companies in China, pulled out the 238 tech companies on the list, and examined which of these companies were targeted with regulations and penalties. And they found that regulators almost exclusively targeted what they called bits, or software companies, rather than what they called atoms, or hardware companies. It's pretty clear that Xi is trying to transform China's economy to be more focused on what he considers strategic industries, which is companies making physical things. But of course, other crackdowns, such as on celebrity culture, the burgeoning feminist movement, and so-called sissy men, make clear he's also just trying to exert more social control. China's going to be doing industrial policy, which is a government intervention, but it's just one of many government interventions that China is doing. Increasingly, China's government is controlling more and more information, behavior, and industry. And it's not at all clear that it's going to be successful. But it's not clear the United States is going to be successful either. We're in what I call a competition of competence. China's offering a model to the world, and so are liberalized countries, including America. The question is, which model will be viewed as successful, and which one will countries want to follow? And it's not clear the US model will be the one people want to follow. The US is now engaging in industrial policy, but are we going to do it competently? In my book, I recommended a number of policies to deal with China, one of which has to do with American infrastructure. So you're thinking, great, Congress passed and President Biden signed an infrastructure bill, problem solved. But the infrastructure bill debate focused on how much we should spend. There was no discussion on why it costs 2 to 3 times more to build infrastructure in America than in Europe or Japan, with no commensurate benefits to the environment or to labor. This chart here shows how building transit costs a lot more in America than most countries, but I could show similar charts for building highways and all other public infrastructure. Perhaps the question shouldn't be whether the US should do industrial policy, but rather, do we have the institutions to do it competently? And what about our response to the pandemic? Are we winning the competition of competence there? The US has had one of the worst health outcomes in terms of deaths per million. And we've shown lots of dysfunction throughout, from failures at the CDC and FDA, to vaccine hesitation, to lack of testing, to a bunch of other areas. And the rest of the world has noticed this, and our prestige and our soft power continue to fall because of it. And we haven't been a particularly great leader for the world, not spending billions of dollars to increase vaccination availability for other countries, even though this would save trillions of dollars, not to mention all the lives it would save. The pandemic, in some ways, is the last nail in the post-World War II, post-Cold War, liberalized world order coffin. We're now back to a pre-World War I great game world. For those that remember history, that did not work out very well. Now, to help keep track of the competition, I've created on my website a US-China index. I'll put in the chat room a link to it. It tracks data in easy to understand charts across 5 big categories: the economy, environment, social, state capacity, and demographics. I might in the future add a 6th category, military, but I'm still determining the best way to measure that aspect of the competition. Now, this US-China index, I just put it up a few weeks ago, so it's a beginning. I'm likely to add data and make changes to it. I'd welcome your suggestions, criticisms, and ways to improve it. So this competition is important. It's likely going to chart the course of what the world is going to look like over the next 30 years. Can we return to trying to evolve a rules-based, liberalized international order? Or is that going to continue to break down and a new order, more to the liking of authoritarian regimes, emerge? I would argue what's happening with Ukraine today is partly a result of a breaking down of the liberal world order. But how will industrial policy play into this competition and the world order? As an example of industrial policy, let's focus in on semiconductors. You've probably heard about the big semiconductor shortage in the supply chain, but China and the United States and some other countries, including in the EU, are actually trying to build up their semiconductor capacity. But when we talk about that, we need to differentiate between types of semiconductors. For semiconductors greater than 45 nanometers, both China and the US actually make a fair amount of those, although Taiwan is the leader. For those between 25 and 45 nanometers and 10 to 22 nanometers, again, there's a fair number of countries that are making those. The United States is actually the leader for 10 to 22 nanometers. But for the most sophisticated semiconductors, those less than 10 nanometers, it's only 2 countries that make those: Samsung in South Korea and a company called TSMC in Taiwan. And TSMC by far makes the most of the less than 10 nanometer sophisticated semiconductors. Now, China recently announced a consortium initiative focused on semiconductor research and development. This new project, which they've named the Cross-Border Semiconductor Work Committee, again, a very sexy title. China bureaucrats are great at really complicated titles. But this new initiative, it's going to be coordinated by a lab at Tsinghua University, which is one of the main universities in China. And Tsinghua University, by the way, has a relationship and a partnership with the University of Washington here in Seattle, where I live. China is desperately trying to increase its capability at designing manufacturing chips of the most sophisticated kind. Again, that's a chip that's currently only made by TSMC in Taiwan and Samsung in South Korea. China's failure or success at this is going to have huge ramifications for the world economy, as more and more products are going to be using these chips. And of course, the United States, we're also working on this. TSMC is building a plant in Arizona and Intel a plant in Ohio. Well, at least as of yet, none of these plants are planned to be able to make these most sophisticated chips. In addition, there's a bill working its way through Congress to increase funding and incentives for domestic semiconductor research, development, and manufacturing. The House version of the bill provides large increases for research and development across all technologies, not just semiconductor technology. This is an area we should watch to see how and what kind of industrial policy works, and perhaps as important, how the governance structure and cultural milieu and other aspects of economy and society will play into the success of it. Batteries are another area to track in the competition of competence. Again, Marco Polo, they just do great work. They examine the lithium battery supply chain. As you can see here in the production of lithium batteries, China is by far the leader, producing 61% of the world's lithium batteries. And China dominates, that's the downstream part of the supply chain. China dominates the midstream as well. They manufacture about 40 to 60% of the main components of batteries, separators, anodes, and cathodes. Basic ingredients of these batteries, from graphite to lithium to nickel, are sourced from many places in the world. It's a complicated supply chain. But speaking of supply chains, for just about the first time in my life, they're actually being paid attention to, because there's been problems in supply chains. Because of the pandemic, lots of lots of countries have been expressing a desire to be able to make key items at home for security's sake, to eventually be more stable. And for a certain discrete number of countries and a few industrial areas, that might be smart to do. But people keep saying the pandemic has shown that global supply chains are fragile. But when they say this, as you can see in the headlines in this slide, they're leaving out a key phrase. Fragile compared to what? What if each country produced everything in-house and then they had to shut down, including farms and factories and deliveries because of a pandemic or some other emergency or calamity? Some of these countries have been negotiating with other countries to get goods like these, but they wouldn't arrive for a long time because there'd be no global supply chain in place to get them to them. And all of our products would be more expensive and we'd have less choice without global trade and global supply chains. Global supply chains have indeed shown some fragility in the pandemic, but compared to the alternative, even today when supply chains are having a lot of problems, they're more stable than the every country for itself scenario that so many people now seem to want to have. We will not make supply chains more resilient by a bunch of countries reshoring assembly and manufacturing. That in fact will make the world more fragile. The solution to reducing fragility in supply chains is to globalize them more. But it's true that there's too many of our world's eggs in China's basket. We need to further globalize supply chains, but in a more diversified way. Fewer goods should have final assembly and components in China. There's likely to be more globalization, more diversified. And globalization, I'll remind you, is what is saving us and getting us out of the pandemic. Vaccines are a wonder of globalization and supply chains. The OECD, the Organization for Economic Development, Economic Cooperation and Development, they released a paper last year on the various aspects of COVID-19 vaccines. As you can see in their graphic here, the ingredients for the vaccines are sourced from a bunch of different places. And so too are the syringes and needles. The US is actually the #1 exporter, but China, Germany, Ireland, Mexico, they all play a role. You see the same thing with stoppers and vials. I'm gonna guess you would not have realized that Poland is a big exporter of stoppers. And vaccines that require refrigeration, a variety of countries export the various components necessary for keeping the vaccine safe and sound, including Romania and Mexico. And what about the development of the vaccines? They were a product of scientific cooperation across many countries, as you see in this OECD graphic. Open information and scientific collaboration, globalization, that's how we're getting out of the pandemic. And the scientists behind the vaccines are themselves from many, many places. A few countries have led the way in vaccine development, but the scientists in those countries, the experts who develop the vaccines, and in the case of the mRNA vaccines, this new technology, they're from all over the world. Many of them are immigrants. So certainly a globalized world helps spread the virus, but a globalized world with global supply chains is much more resilient than one where every country is trying to do everything themselves. And the supply chains and globalization is what is getting us out of the pandemic with these vaccines, as well as medicines to treat us, which are now coming out as well. Some of the countries behind the development of vaccines have strong industrial policies, some don't, but all contributed. So globalization, technology, a recognition of the importance of markets, and what was left of the world order is what is saving us. All countries have industrial policy in one way or another. If we want another century plus of progress, we should look at what got us here and make sure it gets us to the future, even as we try and improve on what we had. We need to understand why there is so much anger. What is the best era in human history? Why are South Korean artists so glum despite things never being better in their country? Why are Americans so angry? Why is there so much anger and so many protests around the world? George Bailey needs to understand he really had a wonderful life. He shouldn't jump off that bridge, and neither should our world. Thanks very much for giving me a chance to present. I'm happy to hear comments, take questions, and have a great discussion.
Oh, sorry there. Hey, Sam, this is Tim DeRoche, Director of Programs for WorldOregon. had to unmute myself. You'd think after almost 3 years we would have that done pretty easily. But let's jump in with a couple questions. One that just popped up, it was just in the news. OPB just ran a story about Oregon having what could be the largest known lithium deposit in the US. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are on sort of a lithium rush as the US and global powers scramble for more of this metal for things like electric vehicles and renewable energy storage.
It's a great question. I hadn't not seen that. That's great. I didn't know that Oregon now has a big store of lithium. Well, that's important. As I noted in that one slide, the ingredients for batteries are sourced from all over the world, and it looks like now will be sourced from Oregon as well. That's the upstream part of that supply chain. I think it's very important that the United States start having more ability in the mid and downstream part of the supply chain as well. As I showed, China makes most of the world's batteries for these new electric cars and electric vehicles and electric trucks and all sorts of other types of things. So it's very important that we build up our ability there as well, and in semiconductor as well. I know Intel has a semiconductor plant, or at least did in Oregon. We need to rebuild up our ability in that area and in batteries, and in this new electric world that we're entering. The climate change is another place where I feel like people are a little too glum about it. It's certainly a huge challenge, but people don't realize how much progress has been made over the last 10 years or so in terms of technology and in terms of adaptation. In fact, the latest UN report on climate change, it used to be 10, 15 years ago, the worst case scenario, I'm going to get the numbers wrong, but the worst case scenario is 5 degrees Celsius increase in heat. That's not likely to happen now because of the progress we've already made, often thanks to technology and also policy. We're seeing a huge revolution in battery storage, in electric vehicles. There's still a lot of work to be done in industry and agriculture, but we've already made a lot of progress. And the United States can help accelerate that progress by I think, doing some industrial policy in that area and supporting our industries and companies.
So you got a little bit at the question of semiconductors, but are there other U.S. industries that might be more suitable for an industrial policy than others?
So I'm putting my U.S.-China index in the chat room. I think there's probably a number. I mentioned batteries. I would think that a variety of some parts of the healthcare industry. So I know there's been concern, some of it is overblown, some concern over that we have to source so many of the ingredients from overseas for our drugs. I experienced this because our cat, believe it or not, takes a heart drug, and that it got in short supply at one point during the pandemic. Though we never had any problem, we were always able to get it, but it just became a little bit more difficult to get it. And a lot of people think all those ingredients are from China, but actually they're from a variety of parts of the country. And maybe we need to shore up some areas there, as well as trying some of the metal equipment we make. The United States and the Seattle area are actually very strong in metal equipment. A lot of defibrillators are made here, ultrasound equipment and others. But China's making it more difficult to export that equipment, which will hurt the industry. So we need to maybe do some industrial policy to keep that going. I sometimes think we need to do better industrial policy around aerospace. Maybe that's because my wife works at Boeing and I've seen Boeing having more and more problems. So maybe that's another area to look at as well. And in cars in general, there's probably some smart things we can do, especially as we're transforming from the combustion engine to electric vehicles. Ford sells a lot of stuff in China, and then Germany. One of the reasons you see Germany so not willing to take on China is their car companies make most of their money in China, not in America or in Germany. So places like Audi and BMW, that's where a lot of their cars are being sold. So trying to keep those industries strong as China continues to build up their auto industry, I think would be important as well.
So according to some people, industrial policy is a little bit like the government putting a thumb on the scale rather than just assuming that market outcomes are going to produce the maximum benefit. I'm wondering if you can talk, because you've talked a lot about the benefits of an industrial policy. Why is it controversial and who is it controversial for?
Yeah, I think a lot of people are concerned, and rightly so, about not wanting the government to pick winners and losers. But there's also different ways to do industrial policy. And many countries have different models of it: South Korea, Japan, China, and the United States. I think it was in the Obama administration when, I'm going to get the name of the company wrong. There was I think it was a solar panel company, Solentra or something like that, that got a lot of loans and then ended up going belly up. So that, that people said, well, there was a waste of money. But if you're trying to provide a lot of, I think one of the ways that we can do our industrial policy is to do a lot more funding for basic research and for applied research from the government, and that is way down from the 1970s in terms of percent of GDP spending. And then you're not necessarily picking winners, but you're helping these industries grow from providing them the research money to do these things. And then I think in the case of China, you need to protect the industries. I don't, in general, think we should be doing protectionism, but with China, you kind of have to, because they're increasingly closing off their market. Now, the smart way to do it is to do it in concert with other countries. In the previous US administration, the one before this, they slapped tariffs and it really went after every country in the world, whether they were allies or not. And so there was really no strategy to how they were trying to deal with some of the trade problems with China and the market access issues in China. So really, we could work with Japan, the EU, and other countries, India, to try and make sure our industries are not being disadvantaged by the China market. The China market is very large, but it's increasingly closed, which, by the way, may start to decrease China's geopolitical leverage. I had drinks with a guy who does a lot of business with China. He's a trade and technology lawyer, fluent in Mandarin. We had a couple of drinks the other night and we're talking about it. And it's increasingly difficult for US and other non-China companies to be successful in China. Because they have something I didn't talk about, is they have a dual circulation policy, which essentially they're trying to keep their exports up, but import less. They want to build up their domestic industries. Well, the more they do that and cut out other countries' companies, then now they have a lot of influence. You're not going to be seeing US or German auto companies saying, oh, we need to be hard on China. But as these companies increasingly get cut out, that might change. And so it's going to be interesting to see how that plays out. But I think you're doing a lot more in research, basic research funding, applied research funding, and in strategic ways protecting our industries from the large China market.
Well, so historically, much of US industrial policy has been undertaken in the name of national defense. So do you see that as useful and continuing as a quote, cover for future industrial policies as they develop in the US?
Well, it's a good question. And maybe politically that will be the way you make it work, because then you can get people on both sides of the aisle to support something like this. My big concern about that, it's an extension of my concern about the competition of competence. I pointed out that it's so much more expensive and takes so much longer to build infrastructure in America. And I could talk about in a bunch of different areas we're just not doing that well. And military is another one. It's always been famous about how inefficient the US military is in terms of procurement and how long it takes to build a new fighter or new ships and so forth. So my one concern trying to root it all through the US military is it might be really, really inefficient to do it that way. It's really something we need to address there as well. All of our institutions, including the US military, have become very bureaucratic, very inefficient. We're just not a very well-run country at this point in a lot of ways. I mean, I hate to say that, but if you just look at the data, that it's pretty accurate.
Well, so interestingly, with great decisions this year, and I'm sure our audience has noticed this, there's been an undercurrent in almost every topic, and it's been about China and about strategic competition. So looking at the national security clampdown and the COVID-0 policy that China has placed on Hong Kong, and relative to that, the massive exodus of both citizens and foreign companies, is this something the US could leverage to our advantage in terms of honing an industrial policy.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great point. And if you check out my US China index, you'll see that I have immigration as one of the measures that I keep track of, because China has done very well economically, but it's not an easy place to live if you like freedom, and not an easy place to live in all sorts of ways. Even wealthy people like Ms. Peng, the tennis player, who has essentially been silenced when she spoke out about being sexually assaulted by a Politburo member, is finding that. And just because you're wealthy or doing well in China does not protect you from harm. So absolutely. And unfortunately, the United States has really tightened the immigration spigots. We should be trying to get more and more talented people to come to the United States. It's something like 50% of all new companies are founded by immigrants. If there's one thing that distinguishes America from the rest of the world, it's not necessarily our Constitution, it's not necessarily our democracy. Now, there's a number of democracies around the world, is that we, more than any other country, historically have been very good at bringing in immigrants, and they're becoming part of the American fabric and immensely helping our economy. As well as I talked about China's aging population and low fertility rates. Our fertility rates have been going down the last few years as well. We need more young people. We should be trying to bring in more young immigrants. And because we're an open society, these new immigrants, whether they're from China or elsewhere, can really get that collaboration working. I showed that graph of how vaccines were made. Vaccines was a collaborative effort. You need to have open information to be able to be successful at that. In fact, at the very beginning of the pandemic, a very brave Chinese scientist released the DNA structure of the virus, and that is why they were able to develop vaccines so quickly. And that wasn't because of the China government cooperating within a liberal world structure. That was because of a very brave single Chinese scientist. So all of those things help. And then China's crackdown on Hong Kong, which is with the national security law and with the zero COVID. I think it'll be interesting to see once the Olympics are over, if China continues the zero COVID policy. They've had the capability to buy the mRNA vaccines for many, many, many months, but have chosen not to approve them yet, apparently because they want to develop their own mRNA vaccines themselves. And they probably will at some point, but it shows they're really becoming a closed society. They're slowly morphing into a much larger, much more economically successful North Korea in some ways, which isn't good for the world, but it does, as you say, gives us, this is an area where we have a big advantage in the competition of competence.
So, interestingly, the whole idea of supply chains, 8 months, a year ago, nobody talked about supply chains. All of a sudden, it's a word that people know, and they can drop into their cocktail conversation when they're having their Zoom meetings. And so some critics say that a push to return supply chains to the US could make us less resilient by concentrating production too much among a few US manufacturers, and that a better approach might be to coordinate with allies such as Canada and Mexico. And I'm curious, how is the updated NAFTA balancing some of these issues? And is this the way to go?
Yeah, the USMCA, that's a good question that I don't know if I have a great answer on, but I do agree. I agree with the criticisms that trying to reshore everything will actually make us less stable. It would make things more expensive and provide less choice, as I noted. I do think there's probably certain strategic things that we may need to reshore, but the rest, it would be good to do it. I think the key, what you said, is trying to do it with our allies. So certainly they call it sort of nearshoring. So you try and do some nearshoring with Mexico and Canada. How the USMCA plays into that, I'm going to have to look into. It's a great question. Some of the big changes in the USMCA had to do with more rigorous labor investigations. So I forget what they were called, but essentially these panels where people can go into Mexico and look at the how labor is being treated in the factories there. But I'll have to think about that in terms of supply chains. In my day job, I talk to supply chain companies all the time. I might talk to them about that a little bit as well. And of course, it doesn't just need to be nearshoring. We can work with countries around the world. To me, Vietnam is one of the five most important countries in the world right now. Their economy is growing rapidly. and they're becoming a key part of supply chain. Before the pandemic, I was going there fairly often. I'm hoping to go there in September. We'll see what happens for work. But as they've been growing economically, before, the hope and assumption would be they would end up like South Korea and Taiwan and other places who grew economically. And then as they reached certain stages, they started to become more liberal politically. But now Vietnam and the Vietnam Communist Party has the China model to look at. They can continue to try and grow economically, but instead of liberalizing, they may apply the China model to make sure they're always in power. Nonetheless, for now, they are really a key ally. They have very big concerns about China. It's not been reported a lot in the Western press, but there's been a lot of stress and turbulence on the China-Vietnam border because Vietnam does not have a zero COVID policy. China is continuing to maintain it. And a lot of stuff goes back and forth between Vietnam and China. Some of the middle part of the supply chain is in China, then comes into Vietnam for final assembly. And it's hurt Vietnam's economy. So it's a big issue. And remember that the last war Vietnam was in was not with America, it was with China in 1979. So there's a lot of worries there. But in general, there's also been supply chain alliances that other countries have created. I believe India, Japan, and Australia have started to build a supply chain alliance. So we should look at the nearshoring, but also the global supply chain alliances to make sure it's more stable. And I might mention also with supply chains, there has been a pivot from the just-in-time to now it's more a content-oriented supply chain. The just-in-time was great, except when you have hiccups or big problems like a pandemic, it has shown that there can be fragility and problems in supply chain. So that last fall, when I was talking to supply chain companies and ports and others, they were really pivoting towards a content first. So for example, back then in September, it wasn't just in time, it was, okay, we got to get stuff that needs to be there in time for Christmas. So certain containers come in, if it wasn't for Christmas, they'd set them aside in a terminal, and then the rest of the stuff that was for Christmas would work its way through the supply chain more quickly. So there's a lot of aspects to this. And I saw someone talking about the ILW union in the questions and talking about that. A challenge for our supply chain, it's not the only reason, but it is a factor in our supply chain difficulties, is we have a lot less automation than in other countries at our ports. And some of that is due to unions being concerned about losing jobs. So that is something we need to tackle. And maybe that's another way that industrial policy could play a role. You know, Canada has a national freight strategy. The United States is just sort of willy-nilly. We're all, our port of Seattle and Tacoma are competing with LA, Long Beach, and with Portland and with Oakland, and then with the East Coast, Savannah and Miami and everybody. It would be good to try and be a little more organized on our funding and our helping infrastructure and our doing better on automation of the ports.
You know, we had a really great program recently with David Bosco, who was writing about ocean health and ocean governance. And one of the bigger issues that has come up is that question with supply chains of carbon emissions. And so if we solve, I'm thinking of a post-COVID world, we solve some issues, supply chains are getting a little leaner and more streamlined, but how do we continue to engage progress and balance and combat climate change globally?
Yeah, it's a great question. And it's obviously a huge issue. As I said earlier, there's actually more room for optimism than people realize on climate change. There's been tremendous technological progress on generating energy cleanly and on storing it cleanly. More work to do, but huge progress in that. Where we're still lacking a lot is in industry. So making things, or like making cement, you emit a lot of carbon into the atmosphere when you do that, or with agriculture it also. So there's a lot of technological progress needs to happen there, which means we need to have policy implementation to help that. Some of the reason for the progress in energy storage and clean energy generation is because of policy, and not even necessarily here, but in other countries. Germany for a while had a lot of subsidies. We've had some subsidies in other countries, and that spurred innovation in that area. At this point, you don't need the subsidies in a lot of ways for solar panels and other things, because if you look at the charts, it's come down exponentially. And you're seeing that with storage now as well. So we need smart policies to subsidize and encourage innovation in industrial processes and in agriculture, among other things. But so, you know, the world met on climate change. I'm going to forget, in pandemic time, I can never remember what happened when anymore. But late last year, I guess it's sort of late in the summer, maybe, in Scotland. And you had a bunch of countries sign a dotted line, making commitments of how much they were going to emit. That's fine, but more important would be to get a lot of countries to commit to providing economic policies that would provide incentives to address these other issues: industrialization, clean industrialization, and clean agriculture. That'll make much more progress than people making imaginary targets that they may or may not meet. They'll meet them when it's they're capable of doing it. The big problem is you want to have. I talk about how, you know, since 1870 we've had so much progress and we made people's lives better. People in India and Indonesia and Africa are not going to give up on trying to make their lives better, and that means we need to have industries that do it cleanly rather than they did how it worked the last 130 years. And it's increasingly possible to do, but we need to encourage it even more. But you're never going to, you know, most of the emissions are coming from developing countries. You're never going to get those emissions down unless we provide them the means to develop in a clean way.
So let's bring things back to the US. And there was certainly a lot of hope going forward with the new administration on approaching some of these issues. And we were very much mired, I think, in the effects of, you know, the previous tariffs and, you know, and a weakening of alliances with longtime partners. And then we had things like the Endless Frontier Act that was passed. And I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about what that is, and if you see US interest, or if you're hopeful about any kind of a sector-based industrial policy that would get bipartisan support, with even somebody like a Josh Hawley signing on.
Yeah, it's a great question. And you know, then this Frontier Act gets to what I was suggesting earlier, that we need to really increase our funding for basic scientific research, which leads to all sorts of industrial and economic benefits. I can't speak to all the aspects of the Endless Frontier Act, whether it's perfect the way it is, or it's the right amount, or being dispersed in the right way. But the general idea of trying to increase our funding for basic research is important. And I think you probably hit on the way that you can probably get those kinds of things passed is using national security as a incentive for people, for politicians, and for people who may not ordinarily be sympathetic to trying to increase funding at all in those areas. We're worried about picking and choosing winners and losers, and worried about too big a government and everything. But you add a national security team, which is a legitimate thing to add because China is a huge challenge for the world. I wrote an entire book about that. And then maybe you can try and get some alliances to make that happen. It's going to mean trying to get some compromise and doing it in different ways, some of the funding. And there's also a whole bunch of people who are working on trying to figure out funding for scientific research in a better way than we do currently. I'm going to get the name wrong. It's like Progressive Studies. I can send it to you on it. But there's a lot of worries that the way the National Science Foundation and others are providing grants is not getting the biggest bang for the buck, and is too bureaucratic. And it also goes to older people like me at universities and at scientific research areas, rather than young people who are generally the most innovative folks. So I think we need to increase funding, and then this Frontier Act provides a lot of funding for that. But we also probably, just like I said, infrastructure, you don't just want to provide a bunch of money for infrastructure. We also need to address how we're doing infrastructure so it's not so inefficient. I think we need to examine the same thing when we're doing basic and applied research funding as well.
Well, you know, you brought up 1870 as a little marker, but we look back a little further, and Hamilton might make for good musical theater, but he was also a really big proponent of early industrial policy. And so clearly this is something that we've been tossing about for a very, very long time. And I want to thank you for helping us think through it a little bit more. And I want to bring Derek back in to take us out into the day. And Sam, it's always a great pleasure having you with us. And we hope to see you soon.
Thanks so much for having me. I really appreciate it. Thanks for all the great questions and comments.
Thanks, Tim, and thanks, Sam, both for your great presentation and your wonderful sense of humor. I know it's tough when you don't have the audience giving you the feedback, but definitely there were some great ones. Who knew that industrial policy would have some stand-up comedian jokes, but nicely done. I note that a couple people asked about this presentation. It will be up on video next week. And then I encourage you to take a look at Sam's website, which has a lot of the charts that were included in this presentation. So people asked about the charts, so I encourage you to take a look at his website. Sam, any other comments before we close out here?
No, thanks again for having me. I'm happy to share as a PDF or something, the PowerPoint, if that's helpful or whatever is helpful to y'all. But thanks for doing this great series and for you guys tackling these important questions. And for tackling global stuff. Not enough people in America talk about global stuff. So kudos to WorldOregon and the great work you all are doing.
Well, thanks, Sam. And our next event, as I mentioned at the beginning of the program, is on pandemic to endemic, lessons from the 1918 influenza. This is a packed event for next Thursday. Encourage you to register for the event this Thursday night. Just posted that link in the chat. We will see you next Friday at this time for the next installment of Great Decisions. Sam, have a wonderful day. Audience, stay healthy. Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye, everybody.